So welcome back, everybody. Our third speaker this afternoon is Karim Nader, or Nader, Nader. Karim is a doctoral researcher at the University of Texas at Austin, and in his work he draws on ethics, aesthetics, and epistemology to understand how technology reflects and affects human values. And his talk for us today is entitled Virtual Fictional Actions, What We Can Learn from Policies on Video Game Violence. So, Karim, about 35 minutes, if that suits you, and please take it away.
Great. So everyone can see my slides. Okay. So thanks so much for having me. I'm Karim, and I wanted to start first by sort of placing my project within two different talks that happened during this workshop. So my starting point is going to be Nathan and Neil's virtual fictionalism, the view that things in virtual reality or merely fictional, we just imagine that they're real. And then I'm also going to use Chris's strategy of using video games as a way to think about virtual reality and augmented reality. Because I have better intuitions about video games and because there's a lot more literature on video games when it comes to these kinds of things. So the plan is to start by defining the view of virtual fictionalism, and then I'm going to try to expand on it by thinking about what it would mean to act in virtual reality if we are fictionalists. Then I'm going to think about how we might morally evaluate actions that are merely fictional in the way that I'm going to describe. And then I'm going to move on to the more fun part of the talk, which I'm going to look into policies that have been passed around video game violence and sort of argue that they kind of take on this fictionalist approach of thinking about virtual actions in that they focus more on the fiction than they do on action. So let's start with virtual fictionalism. Virtual fictionalism is the view that entities in virtual reality and augmented reality are only fictional in the way that Kendall Walton understands fiction and works of fiction. So they have the social function of serving as props in games of make-believe. And what that means in English is that we use sort of words in a book or images in a movie to imagine that what is going on is really going on. But we know that it's not real. We know that Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings is not real, but we imagine that he is for the purposes of make-believe. And to the virtual fictionalists, well, this view that I'm calling virtual fictionalists, digital objects in virtual reality have the same kind of function. So they serve as props that tell us what to imagine, meaning that we imagine that those things are real, even though they're not. And what we imagine is guided by the images and the sounds in virtual reality. So the little pixelated animal on the slide, we can imagine that it's a dog because it's holding a bone, and we know that dogs are usually represented as liking bones. We shouldn't really imagine that it's a cat. If it was holding a fish, maybe we would imagine that it's a cat. But even though it's not clear that it's a dog, just from the pixels, we can make those kinds of deductions and imagine the right kinds of things. Now, one important point I want to make about the view is that the view is not that things that appear to us in virtual reality, like the digital objects, pixels on the screen, the sounds and all that, that those things are fictional. They're not real, right? For the fictionalists, those things are very real. It's just that what we refer to when we refer to virtual objects are not those images and those sounds and those things in virtual reality, or those things that appear to us, but what we imagine. So an example here is that if we want to be fictionalists about Gandalf, we might say Gandalf is the person that we imagine when we see images of Ian McKellen on the screen while watching The Lord of the Rings. Gandalf is not Ian McKellen. So applied to virtual reality, the virtual fictionalist says virtual objects are the things that we imagine when we see images and sounds or digital representations in AR and VR. They're not the digital representations themselves. So this is all I'm going to say about the view itself. Neil and Nathan have a great paper about this, and Nathan gave a talk earlier in this workshop about virtual fictionalism. So I'm going to move on to thinking more about what virtual actions might be to the fictionalist. So I take very roughly virtual actions to be actions that we do in real life, like clicking buttons on a keyboard or a mouse, or moving your head if you're wearing a headset, or like moving a motion tracker in your arm. So those real actions that translate into an action in virtual reality. This is a little too broad, but we'll narrow it down later on. If we add to this very rough view virtual fictionalism, that virtual objects are only fictional, we sort of get this, again, very broad view that says that our virtual actions or actions in real life, so again, clicking buttons on a keyboard or moving a sensor, that translate into some kind of action in fiction. So an action in virtual reality that we understand to be fictional. So in the picture, you can see the real action to pet the dog would be to press A on the keyboard, and that would translate into an action in the fictional world, which would be that the fictional dog is fed, something like that. The problem is that we need some kind of authority to act in fiction, right? Nothing that I do would change anything that is true in, let's say, The Lord of the Rings, right? I don't have the kind of authority to change that fictional world by myself. Some people have that authority, whoever has the rights to make the latest Lord of the Rings movie or series or video game or whatever. But I don't have that kind of authority. So the question I want to ask is, what gives us the authority to act in virtual reality? Like, if in virtual reality is this kind of fiction, then what gives us the right to change it if you want? So I'm going to look at some proposals that are related to video games, but I think it's easy to sort of generalize them to VR and AR. The first one is from John Robson and Aaron Meskin, and they argued that video games are this kind of self-involved interactive fiction where we're inevitably characters in the fictional worlds that are associated with video games. And as characters, we're able to change what is true in a book of fiction, right? So Frodo can change some things that are true of the fictional world of the Lord of the Rings because he is a character within that fiction. And characters are also attributed those actions, right? So Frodo threw the ring and the fire of Mount Doom, he is the agent that acted as such. And so what John and Aaron want to do is sort of explain this linguistic evidence that we have, that when I play a video game and I say I pet the dog, I attribute those actions to myself. Another proposal is from Nele Bender Vasilier, and she is trying to give an account of fictional actions in that specific paper. And she says that for an action to be fictional, we need to somehow imaginatively project into someone who does an action. So what she's trying to do here is sort of exclude things like opening a menu, or when you're playing Tetris, flipping those little shapes. She doesn't want those kinds of things to be fictional actions. So by giving this requirement that we need to project into someone who does something in the virtual world itself, she's able to exclude those things. But she doesn't go as far as saying that we are characters in the fictional worlds of video games. She's just saying we need to imaginatively project into one of those characters. So both of those views can explain this kind of linguistic evidence that we have that we ascribe virtual actions to ourselves. So I think there are a couple of worries with views like this. I have a couple of worries with views like this. The first one is that it doesn't seem like we exist in fiction, right? Like we're real people, we're not fictional characters. So it's hard for me to imagine how we might act from within the fiction. And I think that even if we do this kind of imaginative projection into the fiction, that really doesn't change the fact that our actions are real actions that might correspond to virtual actions, but that doesn't make us, that doesn't sort of like put us in the fiction. Even if actors are sort of role playing or like pretending to be someone else, we can still separate the two different entities. And another thing is that we don't always pretend to be the person. We don't always pretend to be our avatar in fiction. I don't know how we could pretend to be clouds of mist in the metaverse if that was something that, if that's the way we chose to represent ourselves. But the main worry that I have is that it really doesn't get our moral evaluations of virtual actions right, to think of ourselves as acting from inside the virtual world, right? That when we think of characters in fiction like Harry Potter, if we say that Harry Potter killed Voldemort or something like that, then Harry Potter is morally responsible for that act of killing. But someone like Daniel Radcliffe, who's the actor portraying him, didn't do any kind of killing. He's just pretending to kill someone. The same thing is that if we kill someone in a video game, it doesn't make us murderers, right? Even though if we were to evaluate our action from inside of the fiction, the character that we control themselves would have committed something like, would have committed murder. So I want to suggest an alternative here, which I'm gonna call this authorial account of virtual actions. And I'm going to start again with an analogy to fiction to kind of help us think about it. So J.K. Rowling has a very infamous Twitter feed, but we can think of something that she could say. She could say, "I killed Voldemort," and that would be something, I think, true. That in some ways J.K. Rowling is the person responsible for the fact that Voldemort is dead in the fictional world of Harry Potter. Although it's not something that she did from within the fiction, right? She did not cast the spell, say, that killed Voldemort. It's something that she did from outside of the fiction. She changed the props that we use in our game of make-believe to make it true that Voldemort is dead in the fictional world of Harry Potter. And I think it's common to attribute actions to authors in that way. I quickly Googled author killing, and I got like a number of articles that just like give you tips about how to kill off your main character if you want to do that. And I like the one on top that just starts with like, "I love killing people." And it's like, it's funny because that's another way that we can explain the first personal statements that we make when we ascribe actions to ourselves when we act in virtual reality. The problem is that I feel like some people don't think that we're getting the right kind of moral evaluation of our virtual actions when we think about virtual actions in that way. But I think that we can still say something interesting about the moral value of virtual actions if we choose to be if we choose this kind of authorial view of what virtual actions are. I'm going to skip the first bullet point here and just talk about the second one. So the picture that we have so far is that virtual actions are actions that change things that are true of a work of fiction, that work of fiction being virtual reality. And the way that we do this is by sort of acting from outside of the fiction, by just changing those fictional representations. I think we can think, so if we think of virtual actions as this sort of manipulation of fictional representations, we can morally evaluate them as such. And the reason that I like this view is because I feel like it helps us make sense of a lot of different cases where it seems like the kind of wrongs that we do in virtual reality are especially fictional. So I'm gonna talk about a couple of examples here. So in this video game called Lollipop Chainsaw, there's an achievement that you can unlock if you're playing as this character named Juliet, where if you lower the camera so that it shows it's like a little bit under her skirt, Juliet would sort of like put her hands down and sort of like use her skirt to like hide her underwear. And if you keep doing that for a minute or two, then you unlock this achievement called "I swear I did it by mistake," which is just like, I guess, was funny to the developers to joke about those kinds of things at the time. But the idea is that I think that there's something kind of messed up about the fact that this is something that you can do. And I think you can only explain this if you think about the actions that we're doing as affecting the world from sort of outside of it. Because in that specific example, the player is playing as Juliet, right? So if you're imaginatively projecting into someone, you would be projecting into her. When you're moving, she's the one who's moving. When you're attacking, she's the one who's attacking. If there's any character with whom you can identify, it would be her. There are actually no other characters on the screen at the time where you can do this. But I don't think it makes sense to explain that as saying, you know, you as Juliet looked up your own skirt, right? That doesn't make sense at all. We have to think of the player as acting from the outside and creating those kinds of fictional representations where, you know, you're trying to look up a woman's skirt or something like that. So the wrong here is it's a wrong about like imagery, right? Like there's the wrong kind, we're creating the wrong kinds of imageries. We're not doing anything from like within the fiction that could be explained as like a character or a imaginative projection into a character. Another example that's about AR this time is certain filters on Snapchat and TikTok. And there are a few of them. Those are just like a couple of examples where that sort of create the stereotypical representation of Black people or Asian people on your own face if you were to use those filters. Generally, I think that blackface and yellowface are sort of like distinctively fictional wrong. They're only wrong and if you were to sort of imaginatively engage with the fact that you are a stereotype of this different race. And I think the sort of imaginative engagement is sort of necessary for those things to be wrong in the first place. So even the guy on top does not look amused. I wouldn't think that he's doing anything like blackface because I don't think he's imaginatively engaging with the fact that he's this stereotype of a Black person. And I want to be able to distinguish those cases from other cases where maybe you're playing The Sims and you're controlling a Black character. That doesn't seem to be like you're doing blackface because in those two cases, we're able to distinguish between one example in which you are a character in the fiction because they're using your likeliness, and one where you're not. And this distinction, and the fact that we can make this distinction is extremely important to me, because that would mean that for us to act in virtual reality, we don't need to be inside that virtual reality. We can just act from the outside. So we started at 10:05. Okay, good. So now we get to talk about the more fun part. I don't think I have anything specifically like philosophically interesting to say here. I'm just kind of really interested in this history of legislating video games. And I was thinking about how the kinds of things that I'm saying, this fictionalist account of virtual actions, might sort of come out in the different policies that we think about. So I feel like when you're a lot of philosophers who discuss video games sort of refer to this early moral panic, that when video games started becoming more graphic and more violent, people were worried about video game violence. And I think that a lot of philosophers make those kinds of assumptions, that they say that because video games are so interactive, because you're the one committing those virtual acts of violence, we can isolate this specific kind of thing, which is a virtual action, and that thing is something that we can morally evaluate and morally think about. So here's a quote from John and Aaron. They say that while it is true that many other forms of popular arts and culture have generated moral concern, like comic books, rap, and heavy metal, we suggest that the essentially self-involving nature of video game play contributes to the peculiar and persistent level of moral concern that it generates. So what I'm going to try to do in the next 12 minutes is argue against this claim, to say that there's nothing special, that if you take this fictionalist account of virtual actions, then what we're doing in video games is just creating fictional depictions, which is the same kind of things that authors do when they're writing a book, that directors do when they're creating a movie. And I want to look at the history of this moral panic to say that legislators and lawmakers in the United States specifically, although there were analogous laws in Europe, don't really care about the kinds of things that you can do in a video game. They really care about how certain things are presented to the audience. So in the US, the efforts to legislate video games started in 1993. It was after Mortal Kombat came out. And the goal of those, they organized those hearings to discuss the effects of violent video games on children and create legislation to protect the children. So Mortal Kombat, there's a screenshot, is this fighting game where you kind of like, you have to defeat your opponent, you punch them, you kick them until their health goes down to 0. But it was really gory, and you can see from this one screenshot where this guy is getting beheaded. But there were like even worse examples. There were instances where you can pull someone's spine out of them, that you can completely decapitate them, dismember them, all of that. And you can see blood on the screen too here. So like there was blood every time you punch and kick someone. Now, what I want to point out here is that there was another combat game, Street Fighter 2, that came out, I think earlier that year or a year prior to that, that did not cause the Senate, the US Senate, to start those kinds of hearings. And that's because there was no blood, there was no decapitation, and there was no gore. So I think we can ask a legitimate question here, that is the Senate worried about the virtual acts of violence, which in both games you can commit virtual violence? Or are they really worried about the depiction of violence and the gore, the blood, and all of those things? And I think they're worried about the latter. They don't care that you can kick and punch people in Street Fighter 2, but they care that you can see blood in Mortal Kombat. Interestingly, Nintendo asked the developers to remove the violent elements of Mortal Kombat so that they could release it on their console. So the blood became sweat, and like all the decapitation and beheadings like were removed out of the game. And they did that sort of like before going in front of the Senate to sort of like look like they were the ones that had, you know, the interests of young people in mind. But the Sega version, which had all of the blood, sold 5 times as much as the Nintendo version. So that's just a little fun fact. But one game that I don't see people talk about a lot today, but that was equally sort of cause for moral panic for the U.S. Senate, is this game called Night Trap. And Night Trap is a great game because you don't even commit any acts of virtual violence here. So the premise is that you're part of this police squad and you're investigating some disappearances in a house. And you can look inside the house throughout those different security cameras. And you can see here on the bottom of the screen, you can switch between like bathroom and bedroom and garage, and like whatever. And you're investigating, gathering evidence, and then you're trying to trap the killers, the people that are abducting the people in the house. Now, you might think, okay, what's so wrong about that? Well, there was a specific scene in the game that caused a lot of controversy. And it's a scene where this woman in a nightgown is taken off screen by 3 of the black hooded enemies. And you can see one in the back of that screenshot. So this is a screenshot of a recording of the hearing where they show a VHS tape. So it's really bad quality, but it's the best I could find. So that was like what made the senators, the U.S. senators, so angry. But what's interesting about the scene is that basically it indicates that you as a player failed, because your goal when you're playing this game is to protect the woman and to stop her from being captured by those black hooded people. So when you get to the scene, it means it's like game over scene. It means that you lost. But that really didn't matter to Congress, right? What matters to them is that there is a woman that is being depicted in a nightgown and that she's being taken off screen. So again, we can ask a legitimate question here: that are we worried about the player's actions, their goal of protecting the woman and failing to do so, or are we just worried about what is depicted? And I think we're just worried about what is depicted. Now, those hearings didn't lead to any legislation. If you're familiar with politics in the United States, this is often the case, that the Senate just decided to pass things on to our corporate overlords and let the video game industry sort of regulate itself. And that led to the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, which is now the self-regulatory entity in the US that sort of rates game based on whether or not they're appropriate for certain ages. And let's see if I want to do this. I think I'm going to do this. Okay, so if you look at those ratings, it's clear that they don't really care about what you can virtually do, right? So here are 2 examples that I just randomly pulled up from their website. The top example is from the recent game, The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. And in the highlighted portions in both, they're sort of, the ESRB is describing the violent scenes. So in The Legend of Zelda, they say players use swords, hammer, bows, and explosives to attack enemies that generally disappear amid smoke puffs. Compare that with Red Dead Redemption 2, where they describe the violence in this way. They say players use bows, pistols, shotguns, rifles, and explosives to kill enemies in frenetic combat. Shooting enemies occasionally triggers a close-up, slow-motion view of enemies getting shot and killed. And then later on, large blood splatters affect occur during battle, and some weapon attacks result in decapitation and or dismemberment. So again, 2 cases of virtual killings, virtual violence. But what makes one of them a game that is rated, you know, everyone 10 plus, and the other a game rated 17 plus is the fact that violence is depicted a certain way. So one last case study, and then I'll wrap up. Because the ESRB is a self-regulatory entity, there are no laws that sort of restrict the sale of violent video games to minors. And it's actually illegal in the United States to stop a minor from buying a video game, even though it might be rated 17 plus or something like that. And that was decided by a 2011 Supreme Court decision that ruled that video games are protected under the First Amendment, which in the United States protects free speech. So they argued that video games are a protected class of speech, and that restricting their sale to minor would be a restriction on free speech. And they compare video games to video game violence to violence in Homer's Odyssey or Dante's Inferno. So to the Supreme Court, there's no difference really between reading like an especially gory part of Dante's Inferno, where he sort of describes in detail how people are being tortured in hell, and playing a game like Red Dead Redemption, where you can decapitate and dismember other kinds of people. But that wasn't the shared opinion of everyone on the court. There was a dissent. Well, not really a dissent. Justice Alito agreed with the decision overall, but he didn't think that the kind of analogies to literature that the Supreme Court was making was appropriate. And sorry for the long quote here, but I really like it. And I thought we could just read it together. So Justice Alito writes that, he says, to take an example, think of a person who reads the passage in Crime and Punishment in which Raskolnikov kills the old pawnbroker with an axe. Compare that reader with a video game player who creates an avatar that bears his own image, sees a realistic image of the victim and the scene of the killing in high definition and in 3 dimensions, who is forced to decide whether or not to kill the victim and decides to do so, who then pretends to grasp an axe, to raise it above the head of the victim, and then to bring it down, who hears the thud of the axe hitting her head and her cry of pain, who sees her split skull and feels the sensation of blood on his face and hands. For most people, the 2 experiences will not be the same. And I feel like the observation that Justice Alito is bringing out in this passage is sort of what a lot of philosophers, is the sort of intuition that a lot of philosophers try to explain when they're thinking about things like virtual actions. But I don't think we need to sort of dismiss this observation outright, because if we take my authorial view of virtual actions seriously, we might think that the kind of description that Justice Alito is giving about the person committing virtual acts of violence is accurate. It's just not right to compare the reader in the case of Crime and Punishment to the person doing any kinds of virtual killings. We would have to think about what Dostoevsky is thinking while he's writing this scene. And I find it totally plausible that Dostoevsky is imagining those really violent scenes, and he might even imagine himself being part of those really violent scenes as he's writing, as he's describing as he's writing the chapter where Raskolnikov kills the old pawnbroker or something like that. So my claim here is not that the Senate or the ESRB or the Supreme Court or any kind of authorities on the ethics in virtual reality. I'm not saying that legislation around video games are sort of a good guide to thinking about ethics in virtual reality. And I definitely don't think that whether a game is appropriate for certain ages tells us anything interesting about the moral status of the virtual actions that you can do in that game. My point here is just to bring out this fun idea that that when we're thinking about policies around virtual reality, I think the best we can do and what we should do is to say take on the sort of fictionalist approach and to think about what is depicted instead of thinking about the kinds of things that you can do. Ignore this last slide. I kind of wanted to talk about this trope in horror movies where kids kind of like draw really violent scenes, but we can skip over this for now. Here are some of the things that I mentioned in this talk if you want to take a screenshot. And great, we can open it up for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Karim. Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. I'm very sad in a sense. Neil MacDonald was here earlier on, but got called away to a meeting. So I'm afraid he wasn't here to hear you saying kind things about his and Nathan's view. Still, folks, time for some questions. Put your hands up or message me in the chat in the usual sort of way. Karim, I wanted to kick off, if that's okay, by sort of reflecting on this point you touched on at the end about different sort of routes that we might take to trying to regulate this kind of material. I'm persuaded by the way that you've got the target of what they actually wanted to regulate exactly right there. But of course, we can ask a principled question, which for those of us who don't live in the US isn't just settled by the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, about whether the appropriate agent to aim at is legislators and government to try and prevent this certain types of content in AR being an option, I guess, or whether the thing to do is to aim at developers and distributors as the primary agents, going through the mechanism of these voluntary codes of control, which perhaps don't sort of outright prevent certain options being available to people, but signal them in a certain sort of way and perhaps affect the content of them in certain voluntary ways. On the basis of you thinking a bit about the recent history of this, what do you think are the sort of benefits and drawbacks of those two approaches we might take?
I was thinking a little bit about this when with the Mortal Kombat case. It was interesting because in that case, Nintendo, as the publisher of the game, sort of like put their foot down and said, we're not going to have blood on our children-friendly home consoles. And what happened is that they sort of lost the war on that front. They didn't sell as much, which I guess is only a bad thing if you're into this capitalist mindset. But I guess my thought is that I don't think that we're going to stop having violence and sex and war in our popular media anytime soon. And I don't think that targeting video games as this kind of medium that displays sex and violence in a different way, maybe in an interactive way, is any more urgent than regulating violence and sex on late night TV or the movies or literature or things like that. And I'm not really answering your question because I guess to me it's whether that's sort of, well, I guess I could answer your question, and I think that that is just something that developers are always going to want to do, right? They're always going to want to write or make media about those kinds of things, right? Like violence and sex sell for some reasons. So if anyone is going to sort of draw the line, I think it would have to be governments rather than anyone else. Although I don't really care for a line to be drawn. Of course, I'm not talking about like extreme cases where like the line is drawn for like all kinds of media, but I don't think that there is a line for video games that is different from a line that for like movies or things like that.
Sure. No, that seems right. I mean, yeah, you could take different views with respect to the question of what standards should be enforced or upheld, and agree on the question of who the primary agent for upholding them is and what the mechanism is. So no, that makes sense. Thanks very much, Karim. Christopher, you're next on my list.
Hey, Karim, good to see you. I just had a question of clarification about your view of how you resolved the fictional actions in video games that you started talking about at the beginning. Did you say that your view is that people can be morally condemnable insofar as they're creating morally condemnable representations? Was that what okay. I'm just curious if the player's attitude towards their representation matters to you at all. So let me give you two cases. Think of the lollipop chainsaw example of Juliet being upskirted, right? So at the ESRB, that's in the US, the agency that decides what ratings games get, and they also have to justify their ratings by giving descriptors that get printed on the back of a video game box. So there's an employee at the ESRB who has to play the game and has to create these representations to see what's in the game, and then they decide what descriptors to give it. So they are creating representations, right? Morally condemnable ones. In my view, that seems quite different from the pervy teenager who's upskirting Juliet because they're a pervy teenager. But on your view, are you saying that these are morally equivalent because they're creating the same kind of representations?
Right. That's interesting. No, I definitely don't think that that's equivalent. I think it would be absurd if my view sort of entailed that. So let me try to wiggle my way out here. I think there are a lot of different things that can affect whether a fictional representation is okay or not, right? The first one is one example is how widely it's shared. So I could be the kind of person that writes fan fiction in my basement and just sort of leaves it in my Google Drive and no one in the world gets to see it. And in some ways that wouldn't make it sort of if it's the kind of fan fiction that is, I don't know, a little or something like that. I wouldn't really be harming anyone by not publishing it. And that sort of explains the different intuitions that I have with people who share their gameplay on Twitch and people who share their gameplay on YouTube, right? That they sort of are upheld to higher moral standards because they're at least distributing those fictional representations widely to a wide audience. And I definitely think that the kind of response that we have matters if we're thinking about sort of our own personal moral responsibility in the matter, right? So if you remember the screenshot of the man in the Snapchat filter, I don't think he was doing anything close to blackface because he wasn't sort of engaging with the fictional work as this kind of imaginative way that we would expect people, who are doing something wrong when they're doing blackface or doing. But I guess my point here is that there's nothing different here between video games and virtual reality as a work of fiction and other kinds of works of fiction, right? That I could read a work of propaganda, fictional propaganda, to do some kind of research, and I wouldn't be doing anything maybe morally wrong. Whereas someone who's reading kind of force of propaganda to kind of deepen their racist beliefs or something like that would be doing something wrong. So yes, this is a very good sort of caveat case.
Thank you. Any further questions, folks? Fiona has a question by the look of it.
Thanks, Ben. So thinking about that case where you're the player that we've just been talking about, where you're the player manipulating the camera to look up the girl's skirt. So ignoring the fact that that the action seems morally wrong in certain respects, it's kind of an interesting case because it seems to me, do you think it's a bit like when you break the third wall in cinema, when certain characters kind of turn and address the camera and address the audience sitting there? It seems very much like that. So it seems like it's, you're not doing an action maybe you're not just doing an action like a mouse click, you're not doing an action as yourself in the computer world, like opening a menu. It seems different to that. It seems different to playing a character in a game. It seems like this very distinctive other kind of action, and it seems to me very like that breaking the third wall, like you get in TV programs and movies sometimes. Is that how you're thinking of it?
I wonder if that's really how I think about it, because I feel like in video games, at least, it's so common to address the player, right? Like if you're doing any kind of tutorial in the game, like even in virtual reality, like you are referred to, if you will, like a lot more commonly than you would be if you're watching a movie.
But in this case, so I take it that sometimes maybe you're a character in a game. Maybe you don't, like, sometimes there will be an avatar and you're to identify with the avatar. Other times there's no avatar. It's just like your point of view is your point of view, but you're still a character in the game. But this seems a little bit different, because I thought you said that sort of normally you're playing the character in question whose skirt you're looking up, as you said, it would make no sense to look up your own skirt.
Right.
So that's why I thought of it as a bit like breaking the third wall, because it's not, it's, you know, this is the character that for the most part you're playing and identifying with, and then that's broken for a moment in this kind of interesting, if morally reprehensible way. So it seems like a quite distinctive thing that's going on in this case.
I think my point here is that in video games there's no third wall. Maybe that's one way to put it. What I want to say is that you, if you were to take the view that we exist in those virtual worlds and that we act in those virtual worlds, then there would be a kind of breaking of the third wall, because then it would be like unexpected that, you know, the character would be looking at us as the player, since for all they know, like, we don't exist at all, right? But I think what my view would sort of entail is that there's really no since video games are so interactive, and since we can change everything that happens, there's no third wall in the way that there would be one in movies, because we know that we are affecting, we know that we are behind a screen and that we are changing those kinds of representations, whereas in movies there's no there's a sort of assumption that the characters there don't know that the audience is there. Very loosely, sorry, but does that make a little more sense?
Yes, but I think I'm yet to be quite convinced of that. Maybe that would be the best way to put it, because it seems like you're, you know, for the most part, you are, of course, the character Juliet isn't aware of your existence, but you are, for the most part, the way you set it up, I thought you're for the most part playing her, right? You, for the most part, you're identifying with her in the gameplay. No?
You're playing as her, but to me that doesn't mean that you're identifying with her. That's what I'm trying to argue, right? So what I'm trying to say is that even if you play as someone, that doesn't mean that you have to imaginatively project into that person. It doesn't mean that you have to identify with them in any way. I think that would be really strange.
So could you say what it takes more to then take that further step and identify with them? What's the,
what I think would be required to identify with? I think that if you're in something like the metaverse, and if you're creating a character that you want to look like you, that you want to pass as you, then I think that in those cases it's totally fair to say that there's some kind of identification, like the kind of examples that Eric was discussing at the beginning. My point is that they're not necessary, right? So just because you are controlling a certain avatar in virtual reality doesn't necessarily mean that you're identifying with them, that you're imaginatively projecting into them. And I want to be able to distinguish between those two cases, because I think that in both cases that we would have very different moral reactions to what's going on, right? So if you're in something like the metaverse, that's a social network where there's a sort of expectation that everyone is identifying with their avatar to some kind of degree, then then you could do things that might harm them in some morally relevant way. Whereas, like, if you're interacting with computer generated models that no one is identifying with, then that's sort of like a different case. And if we think that every avatar in virtual reality is that anytime you control an avatar in virtual reality, you identify with them, then you lose those kind of subtleties, those like changes in sort of like expectations that you can have, right?
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I guess I would think that the further steps don't really turn on looking like or passing for you, but more things like whether you can be harmed or something like that. But yeah, thank you. That gives me a bit of a sense of wouldn't those cases then in which you do identify with the character be a case in which you could use that kind of situation to create a breaking of the third wall? Like, couldn't someone build a game in which you did identify with an avatar and then that could be broken in the Juliet style way?
But how would it break? I guess what I'm thinking is that the sort of observation that I want to try to make here is that no one is pretending that like virtual reality is this other world that exists distinct from reality. We all know what is going on. We all know that there's someone on the other side of the screen. We all know that it's interactive. We all know that, you know, we're not tricked into thinking that it's real. So where's the illusion here? Does that make sense? Like, where's the illusion that's being broken with the breaking?
I guess most people don't think films are real either, but there can still be that.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
I think I might have to cut this discussion short, folks. If only we were all in Glasgow together, we could go to the pub and talk about this at greater length. But I think for now, I'd like us to thank Karim very much for a very stimulating presentation and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.